I am here at the 66th Dysprosium Eastercon convention with Jim Burns. Jim is a 3-time winner of the Hugo Awards and a 12-time winner of the British Science Fiction Association Award. So today Jim is going to talk to us a little bit about his work and his many collaborations. No, but actually your career has really touched on all sorts of medium as well, and I remember talking to you about doing the cover for Game of Thrones for Martin's books. Can you tell us about that experience?
Yes. Oh, well, in terms of using different mediums, that's a great one to pick on, really, because I nearly lost my mind doing those paintings. Back then, we're talking about the sort of mid to late 90s, those books were about to be published. They needed cover artists for the first edition hardbacks. I did those very first editions in the UK for HarperCollins. It was published in the UK first. And at the time, the general drift of high fantasy books were for highly decorative covers. You have lots of little panels and decorative curlicues and little elements of the narrative showing. I thought, well, I'll take that approach, but I'll up the ante a bit. I'll make it classier. And so what I decided to do was I went out and bought myself a bunch of real wood veneers. And I thought, veneering, it can't be hard. The paintings are quite big, you know, they're sort of this kind of size, the originals, with vast acreages of expensive veneer on them, which it's very easy to ruin pounds and pounds worth of veneer. You know, just it splits and it cracks and it's hopeless. And within the cut frames, all beautifully cut with the scalpel and all the rest of it, I painted these little windows of stuff, you know, and I created the first volume. At the end of it, totally exhausted by this process, and it took quite a long time. And they said, "Okay, we love that." And then there's volume 2, and there's volume 3, and there's volume 4. And I really tired myself out with them. And they came along at a time when a few other things were not going too well in my life, and financially and all the rest of it. So I do tend to link them with a rather unfortunate period. And every time I think of them, it gives me a little shudder. Those are the 4 Game of Thrones pieces, or as you can see, all the veneers.
Yes, they are.
And you see all these little bits that are cut out are all wooden veneer. And you've got the marquetry, I suppose you call it, these little inlays done in different exotic woods.
Yeah.
And I did all of them like that. I did do a 5th one, which wasn't used in the end, which I thought I simply cannot do this anymore, and I did it digitally. And I just basically sampled wood and created it on. I couldn't do it anymore.
So how did George Martin react to your paintings?
Well, all I've ever got back from him really is pretty favourable comments. He seems to be a fan of the work, but then there's a lot of Game of Thrones work out there. And he does encourage artists a lot. He's very interested in that whole field. I think in more recent times, because he's acquired a certain power within the industry, I think he has someone, it's maybe apocryphal, I don't know, but whenever artwork is now created for Game of Thrones, he has first refusal on it. I might be wrong. This is something someone told me.
Okay.
He gets first refusal on it. So, but mine went to the guy in Canada first. I wonder if I'd have got more money if George had them. I don't know. But I think, as far as I'm aware, he liked them. But what you have to remember is back then, he's become famous. Everyone's heard of him because of Game of Thrones on TV. Back then, this was another high fantasy series, and most people had not heard of George R.R. Martin. I'd heard of George Martin because it happens to be my father-in-law's name as well. There's a George Martin in the family, but he was the more famous one to me. Then suddenly this other George R.R. Martin came along, and I'd known him for some time before, on and off at conventions, as a writer. You know.
Yes.
He then became very, very famous, and since when, I did a couple of other pieces for him as well, for one of his early science fiction novels called Dying of the Light, and Windhaven, which he co-wrote with Lisa Tuttle. And wouldn't you know that because they liked the veneer work at HarperCollins, they wanted me to incorporate some veneer into those 2 as well, but they were a little easier. I recently completed the painting I mentioned with the sexy space babe and the spaceship. There was a proviso which I hadn't realised at the time. It had to be one as conceived in a book by George R.R. Martin. And so he sent me, the collector sent me a book called Tup Voyaging, which is an early collection of stories by George based on science fiction themes. And there's a character called Rika Dawnstar, who is the sexy space babe, basically. I met a Welsh girl who was the model for that one, Catra. Very good, I've used her since as well. And yeah, as far as I know, George has been happy with the work, but I don't see much of him. I saw him last year at Longcon. We had a chat about some painting. He was looking at this painting. That's a print of a painting I created as the special artwork for Eastercon a couple of years ago. And it just struck him, as it strikes others, as being very reminiscent of the mood of Game of Thrones.
Of course, the Mother of Dragons.
Yes, yeah, which is a pure coincidence, really. The girl is Rosie, who was the local barmaid in the pub I go to every Friday. And I persuaded to talk her into it one day. Very shy girl, but lovely girl. And I just asked her to pose as whatever. Well, I call the painting Hatchling.
Hatchling, yes.
And it's just for myself, but I didn't manage to sell that one eventually.
It's gorgeous.
And George liked that one, so he likes this kind of work, you know. So hopefully those little paintings of mine went down well with him. But they were just. I don't think George himself would have realised at the time that Game of Thrones would become the phenomenon it became.
It's very interesting. And I do know that you love to use people that you know as well, or people in your life, in your family, as your models. For example, your daughters.
Oh yes.
I believe
both of these.
we have the two daughters of Jim here.
That's Megan, my middle daughter, and Gwendolyn, my youngest daughter. I'm still to use my oldest daughter, Eleanor. I'm very fortunate to have very beautiful daughters who are very happy. They're also as models, they're very cheap.
So, Jim, can you tell us a bit about the various artists or directors and writers you worked with?
Well, I've been doing this for 42 years now, so it's a long time. And in that time, I've met lots of, principally, great writers. Most of my work has been with most of the big names you'll know in the world of science fiction writing. So I've had collaborative, if you like, relationships with people like Harry Harrison. Very important project early on in my career with Harry, which really set me on the road, I think, more than any other single project, which was an illustrated novella called Planet Story. And that saw over 2 years my work sort of took off in leaps and bounds in terms of my own confidence and technique, etc., etc. Got a monthly fee, as I recall, instead, like a salary for two years, which is very helpful for an aspiring young freelance artist who, every penny counts. And then after that, 1980, I met Ridley Scott, who'd seen actually a picture in Planet Story that inspired him to basically employ me on the film he was going to make. Was a movie for June, actually. Okay. Not the one we're familiar with, which is Blade Runner. And the character in Planet Story, for him, really did sort of the character of Baron von Harkonnen in June struck him as being just right for that. So it was going to be employed on the film June with Ridley Scott. The film fell through. My Hollywood career was stillborn. However, his production manager one day phoned me up and said, "Sorry, Jim, it's fallen through. Damn." However, are you still interested in working on a movie? And have you read a book called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Because Ridley's working on the movie version of that. And yet another painting of mine that I created for another book called Tour of the Universe was a piece of work that inspired Ridley in part to employ me for that movie, because the police spinner, you remember from Blade Runner, the flying police car, kind of its original incarnation, its early inspiration derives from something I created for Tour of the Universe. Later on, of course, Sid Mead took up the themes and ran with them, basically. But I was employed for 10 weeks over in Hollywood on that movie, doing some very early concept work. Not a great deal of which I think I can see in the final movie. My wife says differently. She says it's still there, there's some ghost of it there. But that was that early bit of film work. And then I really got established very much with American writers generally for the publishing. Most of my work through the 80s was, probably most, certainly I think more than half of it was for various American publishers. In particular, I worked a lot with a writer named Robert Silverberg. And of all the work I've ever done, most covers for any single writer have been for Robert Silverberg, which is something like 45 pieces of work for his books. They were being published at the same time, both in the US and the UK, and I was getting both pieces of work, and they wanted different covers for each, so I was running them alongside each other, two covers for the same books. So this was all great, and Joe Haldeman, Harry Harrison, as I say, a whole bunch of writers I worked with. Then through into the 90s, writers like Peter Hamilton in this country, probably Britain's biggest selling science fiction writer, again did a lot of books for him. And that's been the kind of mainstay of my career, has been the book jacket work, certainly. Up until the late 90s, when the writing was on the wall, I think, for traditional artists, generally, not just myself, working in paint, that the way the publishing was going was down the digital road. And so for me, it was either, what do I do about this? It meant fee reductions, huge drop in fees with digital work. Why pay, if you're paying someone to do a big painting that takes a month to paint, it's got to be good money for that.
Yes.
If you can turn out a digital jacket in the space of a day, it's not going to offer the same fees. So the whole equation became very difficult in terms of making a living. I did buy myself a Mac, and I did engage with that sort of work, and you see some of it on the walls around us, the kind of digital work I create for book jackets. However, these are the smaller frame pieces, essentially are all digital. But through all that time, I was never going to stop painting. I mean, my first love is paintings, proper paintings. And so I've gone on doing that through the intervening years. It's been a lot of financial up and downs in my life, I must say, causing all kinds of issues, downsizing my house twice, etc. But finally finding a new, level playing field, whatever. And in more recent times, I'm doing a lot more work for myself. Some increasing amount of work to private commission, mostly for American collectors. Seems to be a market that's beginning to burgeon, if you like, out of those of us who used to do this book jacket work, who we didn't have anywhere to go with it, basically.
Okay.
But there has always been a strand of the fantastical amongst people who paint pictures. It's been sort of lying low, and for a century, if you like, a lot of Victorian artists worked in the world of the fantastical, really, think of the pre-Raphaelites and the symbolists and all the rest of it. Then I think through the 20th century, it all went a bit underground, and it became part of the commercial milieu, if you like, through pulp art and science fiction, cover work, etc. Digital came in, but that mindset was still there in some of us to paint this stuff, because that's all I ever want to paint, is just crazy stuff. And so what's come out of that is this growing market in the US in particular, helped along by people like the Wilshires, who started an annual event called Eastercon, which is the Symposium of Imaginative Realism.
Imaginative realism, that is a very interesting term.
That's what we now call ourselves. We don't call ourselves science fiction artists anymore. We now have the gravitas that's implied by being imaginative realists, which is, makes one feel like I'm a serious person at long last. And so, and mostly my work in recent times has veered a little bit away from the hard science fiction, if you like, although I still do a bit of that. I still enjoy the occasional spaceship, it's one of my most recent pieces up there, digitally. Yes. But what I'm particularly interested in is going into the world of mythology, romantic poetry. I mean, I've got a piece on the go, a big painting at home, perhaps the biggest I've ever painted, based on a Keats poem, Isabella or the Pot of Basil, which is an old, it's a theme that was much explored by Victorian artists. There's lots of versions of that painting, but the poem itself is actually very dark, and I'm bringing that dark side out, rather than the rather twee, romantic Victorian approach. I'm making it a much more sinister-looking thing.
This has been an absolute honor and pleasure. I've been here with Jim Burns, and I'm an ecstatic Francesca Barbini from the Sci-Fi and Fantasy Network.